In the last section, we established that we're going to beeline figuring out whether or not the current user is logged in. We then spoke a little bit about how our server already has an API route put together for telling us whether or not the user is logged in. So essentially, we need to make an AJAX request to our backend, and that will tell our React application whether or not we are authenticated. Now, going into this process, I'm doing a lot of build-up here because we're going to very quickly touch on several different libraries, and we're going to touch on a lot of different topics within our React application. And so this is something that really does deserve a little bit of build-up, because once we start going through it, we're going to be really covering like 4 or 5 different important concepts at the same time. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a diagram that very clearly describes exactly how we're going to pull this off. So when our React application boots up, we are going to make sure that our app component, which is our essentially root component, calls an action creator. And this action creator is going to be responsible for figuring out, or I should say making an API request to our backend and asking whether or not the current user is logged in. So we're going to imagine that this action creator is a function called fetchUser or something like that. Inside of that action creator, we are going to use the Axios library to make an AJAX request to our backend API. So specifically to the route API/current user. So that request is going to go out to the Express API, and then we're going to get a response back, presumably containing the user if the user is logged in. Once we get the request back, we are then going to use a library called ReduxThunk to dispatch an action off to all the different reducers inside of our application. And so once we dispatch this action, the action which contains the information of whether or not the user is logged in is then going to be sent to our auth reducer. Our auth reducer will be responsible for looking at that action and then updating some internal flag inside of it to say, yes, the user is logged in, or no, they are not. Once we have that new updated piece of state, we're then going to update the content inside of our header by setting up the header to communicate directly with our Redux store. So again, this is a pretty complicated, pretty involved process. The good news is that we are going to repeat it several times throughout this course. Essentially, for every API request we put together, we're going to go through this exact same process. So we definitely will get a lot of practice with it. Okay? So let's get started. Really no reason to dawdle anymore. The first thing we're going to do is install the Axios library and the ReduxThunk library. Axios is responsible for helping us make API requests or AJAX requests to our backend API, and ReduxThunk is something that we use to helpfully maintain or kind of make asynchronous action creators behave the way we expect. Okay, so let's install these and then we'll start wiring all this stuff up. Over in my terminal, I will change on over to the server. I'm going to kill the server and then change into the client directory because these are both client modules that we want to install. We will npm install -- save Axios and then also redux -thunk, like so. Okay, so while that installs, we're going to flip back over to our application and we will first start off by wiring up ReduxThunk. Now, we're not going to say right away exactly what ReduxThunk is all about, but we will very shortly, once we start working on the action creator, we will talk about exactly what it's doing, okay? So inside of my client src index.js file, I'm going to import the ReduxThunk and hook it up to our create store call right here as a middleware. Now again, we'll talk about exactly what ReduxThunk is doing, but we're going to hold off on discussing it in depth for right now. So I'm going to import ReduxThunk from redux-thunk, and then we're going to pass that thing to the apply middleware call right here. So I will pass in ReduxThunk, like so. Okay, next we're going to create an action creator inside of our project. Remember, action creators are where we somehow initiate change inside of the Redux side of our application. So they are used to kind of modify the state that is contained inside of our Redux store. Again, if you're here, kind of assuming that these terms are familiar, at least somewhat, I am going to assume that you may not be familiar with ReduxThunk. If you're not, that's totally fine. We'll be going over that from scratch. But for these general Redux terms, just kind of assuming that you are familiar with them. So to create an action creator, I'm going to make a new folder inside of my src directory that's going to be responsible for housing all the code around all of our different action creators. So inside the src directory, I'll make a new folder called actions. And then inside of here, I'm going to create our first action creator inside of a file called index.js. Now for this first action creator we put together, we're going to put it right into this file, but immediately after we finish this entire header thing, we're going to come back here and do a little bit of a refactor to make sure that all of our different action creators are well organized inside the actions directory. So for right now, everything inside of index.js, but very shortly we will come back and refactor this stuff. Okay, so at the very top, I'm first going to import the Axios library. Remember, we use Axios to make AJAX requests. So I'll import Axios from Axios. And then I'm going to define our action creator. And I'm going to call this thing fetch user, like so. Now for right now, just like I said that we're going to place all of our action creator code inside this index.js file and then refactor it later, we're going to do something not quite similar with the action types. So we are going to declare our action types in a separate file inside of our actions directory still. So inside the actions directory, I'll make a new file called types.js. And then inside of here, I'm going to create and export a new action type called fetch user. So I'll say export const fetch user equals fetch user. So now we'll immediately import this type into our index file inside the actions directory. So back inside of index.js, we will import fetch user from types, like so. Okay, so this is looking pretty good at this point. Now again, we're going to be making use of Axios to make this network request. So inside of the action creator, inside of fetch user, I will call axios.get because we want to make a GET request to our backend. And then we're going to pass in the route that we care about. So the route to our API. Remember, we just looked at that route handler in the last section. If we go back to our root routes directory and find the authroutes.js file, at the bottom of that thing, we found that we had that route handler right here that could automatically return the current user if we made a GET type request to API/current user. So back inside the src actions index.js file, we will make a GET type request to API/current user, like so. Now, really important, remember, we're only putting the relative path to our backend server here. This goes back to the whole discussion we had about how relative paths are working inside of our application. In the development environment, we make use of our proxy to forward the request onto the API, and then the proxy will send a response back to the React application. And then in production, there is no proxy, there is no create React app server, that whole proxy thing falls away, and a request to API/current user would go directly to our Express backend. So before we go any further than this, I want to make sure that we change over to our package.json file inside of our client project and make sure that we've already got a proxy rule put together for handling this request right here and sending it off to our real Express backend. So inside of our client directory, I'll find the package.json file. Inside of here, I should already see our existing proxy rule. So there it is right there. So we're going to add on one additional proxy rule to make sure that any request to our API successfully gets forwarded on to localhost 5000. Okay, now I am going to say that I don't really want to have to add on a separate proxy rule for every last API route that we tried to make a request to. I really want to just set up as few rules as possible and kind of have everything just figure itself out from there. So keeping that in mind, we're going to add a second rule to the proxy object. The route that we're going to watch for will be /API/*. And so with this rule right here, with this rule saying star right here, that means if any request whatsoever comes from the React side of the application looking for API/current user or API/surveys or API/anything else at all, just go ahead and forward it on to the Express API. So we'll instruct the rule that is what it should happen by adding on target of http://localhost:5000, like so. So with this single rule right here, we don't have to worry about coming and adding on an additional proxy rule for every API request we make. Just this one right here will catch everything that goes to API/anything. Okay, so that definitely is going to save us some time in the future because we don't have to worry about all this proxy stuff again for essentially the entire course, which is definitely a big help. All right, so let's close out the package.json file, and then we're back at our action creator right here. Now, very shortly, we're going to start talking about that Redux Thunk library. We're also going to make sure that this request that we're making here makes use of that async await syntax that we spoke about very previously in many videos ago. So again, there's like a lot of topics that we're covering here simultaneously. So with that in mind, I want to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to start talking about some of the basics of Redux Thunk. And then we're also going to talk about how we use Redux Thunk along with that async await syntax for handling asynchronous requests or handling promises like what's returned from this thing right here. So let's continue in the next section and start talking about those two additional topics.